June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell reached us before anything else. It drifted slowly across the yard, warm and heavy, as if it were unafraid of the barbed wire. It came from somewhere beyond the mess hall doors, rolling through the dust and settling in our lungs before we had time to understand it. Meat. Real meat. Not the faint memory of it, not the watered shadow we had lived on for years, but the full, unmistakable weight of it. Beef, fat melting, onions breaking down into sweetness, black pepper biting at the back of the throat. I remember thinking, very clearly, that the smell did not belong in a prison. Prisons, as I understood them, were supposed to smell like damp wood, sweat trapped in wool, disinfectant spread too thin. They were supposed to smell empty, hungry. This smell was none of those things. It was thick, confident, domestic. It smelled like a kitchen that expected people to sit down and eat. Around me, the other women stopped walking. Boots froze mid-step on the gravel. A hand tightened around a metal tray. Someone whispered my name, but I didn't turn. I was afraid that if I moved too quickly, the smell would vanish, like so many other things had vanished over the last 5 years. We stood there, 30 of us in faded gray uniforms that no longer held their shape, staring at a low wooden building as if it had done something impossible. Steam curled out from the open doorway, carrying with it the sound of liquid moving, slow, deliberate bubbling, the kind that only happens when food is given time. Inside, I could see the edge of a black cast-iron pot. It sat on a heavy stove, scarred and polished smooth by use, the kind of pot my mother used to talk about before the war, before iron was requisitioned and kitchens were stripped down to nothing. A ladle rested against its rim, thick with stew, and when it shifted, the sound was deep and dull, not hollow. Someone laughed softly behind me. It was a broken sound, halfway to panic. Cowboy stew, one of the guards had called it the day before, almost casually as if naming the weather. At the time, I hadn't understood the words. Now, standing there with the smell filling my chest, I understood them too well. Beef, potatoes, onions, black pepper, food meant to fill a man who had worked all day under the sun. Texas food. That was the second shock, not the stew itself, but where we were. Texas. I had learned the name during the journey west, watching the land flatten and stretch beyond anything I had known in Germany. Ranch land, the guards said. Cattle country. A place where beef was not counted by grams or coupons, but by herds that moved like weather across open ground. In Germany, by 1944, soup had become a rumor. A pot of water with a potato skin floating in it was still called a meal. Here, in a country fighting the same war, the smell alone felt extravagant. A woman beside me pressed her fingers into my sleeve. "Anna?" she whispered, her voice tight. "Do not touch it." I hadn't moved. None of us had. The line had stopped entirely, backed up all the way into the yard. Guards watched from a distance, rifles slung low, not raised. They weren't shouting. They weren't rushing us. They were waiting. That, too, felt wrong. Inside the hall, metal trays waited in neat stacks. Heavy ones. Real ones. The kind that didn't bend when you pressed your thumb into them. I picked one up and felt its weight pull at my wrist. Even the utensils were wrong. The spoon they handed me was thick, solid steel, its bowl deep enough to hold something substantial. In Germany, spoons had grown thin, warped, their edges sharp from years of scraping empty pots. Nothing about this place felt temporary. I caught my reflection in the dull surface of the spoon, my face narrower than I remembered, my hair pulled back too tightly because there was nothing left to spare. Behind me, the others shifted uneasily, eyes fixed on the pot. A man stood behind it, tall and sunburned, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He wore no crisp uniform, no polished boots, just denim, a plain shirt, and a hat set back on his head. "A cowboy," someone murmured, the word strange on her tongue. He dipped the ladle into the stew and lifted it slowly. Thick liquid poured back into the pot, carrying chunks of meat and potato with it. He didn't rush. He didn't look at us as if we were dangerous or fragile. He moved the way someone moves when feeding people is simply part of the day. The smell intensified as the stew hit the air, and my stomach tightened painfully, not with hunger alone, but with confusion. I had been captured nearly a year earlier. In that time, every expectation I had carried with me had been stripped away, but none so completely as this. We had been told that America was wasteful, cruel in its excess, careless with human life. We had been told that capture meant humiliation, but no one had prepared us for abundance offered without ceremony. Outside the camp fences, I knew factories were running without pause. We had passed them on the train. Endless buildings, smoke rising steadily into clean skies untouched by bombers. Women in overalls, men moving with purpose, machines louder than anything left standing in Europe. The guards talked sometimes, not to us but to each other, about shifts and quotas, about planes and ships produced faster than they could count. "The arsenal of democracy," one of them had said once, laughing at the phrase as if it embarrassed him. Standing there with a tray in my hands, I began to understand what that meant, not as a slogan, but as a reality. This country had food to spare, enough to feed its soldiers, enough to feed its civilians, enough somehow to feed its enemies. The question settled heavily in my chest, unspoken but shared by every woman in that line. What kind of country feeds its prisoners like this? No one answered. The man behind the pot finally looked up, met our eyes briefly, and nodded toward the ladle. "Step forward," he said, not unkindly. I took a step. The tray trembled in my hands. That was when I knew, before a single spoonful had been eaten, that something far larger than hunger was about to break. I stepped forward, and the line moved with me, but our bodies advanced while our minds stayed behind. The bowl was placed in front of me, heavy and warm, the metal radiating heat through my palms. Steam rose in slow, steady breaths. The surface of the stew shifted slightly as I stopped, thick enough to hold its shape, alive with pieces that were unmistakable. Meat, potatoes, carrots softened by time, not boiled into surrender. The spoon rested beside the bowl, waiting. And yet, no one ate. We stood there, 30 women holding full bowls of food, frozen as if a command had been given that only we could hear. The smell pressed harder now, wrapping around us, pulling memories to the surface that hurt more than hunger ever had. For 5 years, soup had been our constant companion. Not soup as it was meant to be, but soup reduced to an idea. Water tinted brown or gray depending on what scraps had been found that day. A potato sliced thin enough that it disappeared before it reached your mouth. Sometimes nothing at all, just hot liquid to quiet the stomach long enough to sleep. We learned to drink it slowly, to let the warmth fool the body into believing it had been fed. In the winter of 1942, I remember counting 3 potatoes for 8 women, boiled until their edges collapsed. We divided them carefully, measuring fairness by instinct because there was no room for error. By 1943, even that became rare. The soup grew thinner. The color faded. Sometimes it smelled faintly of cabbage. Sometimes it smelled of nothing. That was Germany then. Cities hollowed by bombing, fields neglected, trains rerouted for war instead of food. Women stood in lines that moved only because standing still meant freezing. Children learned to stop asking for more because there was never more to give. We were told it was temporary. We were told sacrifice meant victory. And we were told, very clearly, what would happen if we were captured. The Americans, they said, did not understand discipline. They would humiliate us, parade us, strip us of dignity because they did not value it themselves. They would poison us slowly, or worse, experiment on us, on our bodies, on our minds. That was how they fought, we were told, without honor. So, when the bowls were placed into our hands, full and steaming, the lesson did not disappear. It screamed. This is how it begins. I looked down at the stew again, my stomach tightening painfully. The spoon felt heavier now, as if it were testing me. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. Around me, the others shifted their weight, eyes darting not to the guards but to one another. We were waiting for someone to make the first mistake. A woman, 2 places ahead of me, swayed slightly. Her name was Liesel. She had been a seamstress before the war, her fingers once so quick they seemed to blur. Now they trembled as she lifted the spoon, hovering it over the bowl without letting it touch. "I can't," she whispered, though no one had spoken to her. "I can't." Another woman, Marta, did something worse. She glanced once at the guards, then tipped her bowl sharply, letting the stew spill onto the dirt at her feet. The liquid soaked into the ground, darkening the dust. A piece of potato rolled free and came to rest near her boot. The sound it made, soft, final, was unbearable. Several of us gasped. Someone made a strangled sound that might have been a sob. Marta stared at the empty bowl, her face pale as if she had just witnessed a death. No one moved to stop her. No one could. The guards noticed, of course. He felt their attention shift, the air tightening in expectation of punishment. That was what should have happened. That was what we had been trained to expect. But nothing did. No shouts, no raised rifles. The man behind the pot simply watched, his expression unreadable. He did not scold her. He did not replace the stew. He did not even speak. He waited, the ladle still in his hand, as if time itself had slowed to see what we would do next. My hands began to shake. I realized then that I was not afraid of being poisoned. I was afraid of being wrong, afraid that if I ate, if I accepted what was in front of me, something deeper would collapse, something that had held me upright through bombings, hunger, and loss. Because if this was real, then everything else had been a lie. In Germany, by 1944, reality had shrunk. It was measured in ration cards and whispered news, in the hollow sound bombs made when they fell too close. We had learned to live inside that narrow space because believing in anything larger hurt too much. America, in our minds, had been folded neatly into the same shape, cruel, dangerous, predictable. But here, standing in Texas with a full bowl in my hands, nothing fit. This country had not known hunger the way we had. Their farms stretched unbroken, their cattle counted in numbers we could not imagine. While our cities burned, theirs glowed at night, factories running without pause. While we boiled water and called it soup, they fed armies, civilians, and, somehow, us. The contradiction was suffocating. I saw it in the others' faces, the way their eyes filled not with tears but with calculations. If this is a trick, how long will it last? If it is poison, how quickly will it act? If it is humiliation, when will the laughter begin? The spoon hovered in my hand, suspended between years of fear and the unbearable pull of hunger. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain the guards could hear it. I imagined my mother's kitchen, the way she used to stir soup slowly, never letting it boil too hard. I imagined her telling me to eat while it was hot. I did not lift the spoon. None of us did. We stood there, bowls untouched, prisoners not of barbed wire or guards, but of the stories we had been told about the people standing in front of us. And somewhere, just beneath the fear, a far more dangerous thought began to take shape. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. If they are not what we were taught, then what does that make us? For a long moment, nothing happened. 30 bowls of stew cooled in our hands while fear held us perfectly still. I remember thinking that this was the point where the illusion would break, where the shouting would begin, where a guard would step forward and remind us who we were. Prisoners, enemies, women who did not get to choose. Instead, the man behind the pot did something so ordinary that it took a second to understand its weight. He picked up a bowl, not one of ours, his own. He ladled the stew carefully, the same way he had done for us, filling the bowl without flourish. Then he stepped away from the stove, leaned his hip lightly against the wooden counter, and began to eat. He did not rush. He did not look at us to see if we were watching. He lifted the spoon, blew once across the surface, and took a mouthful as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The sound of it, the soft scrape of metal against the bowl, cut through the hall more sharply than any order could have. A ripple went through the line. Someone inhaled sharply. I felt my chest tighten, the breath catching there because this was not part of any warning we had been given. This was not how humiliation worked. This was not how poison was administered. The cowboy, because that was what he was, there was no other word for it, stood there in rolled sleeves and a hat worn thin at the edges, eating the same stew he had just served us. No gloves, no distance, no performance. He swallowed, then took another bite. Only then did he look up. His eyes moved across us slowly, not scanning for weakness or defiance, but simply taking us in, as one might take in a room before speaking. His face was weathered, the kind that comes from years under open sky. There was no hardness in it, but no softness either, just calm. "There's more," he said, his voice low and even. "Eat slow." That was all. No warning, no command, no speech about rules or generosity. Just a statement of fact, offered as if he were speaking to ranch hands at the end of a long day. Something shifted in the room. Not relief, not yet, but confusion of a deeper kind. The kind that makes you question the ground beneath your feet. I watched him lift the spoon again, watched his hand steady and sure, and felt the carefully constructed image I had carried of Americans begin to fray at the edges. He was not trying to convince us of anything. That, I realized, was the most unsettling part. In Germany, kindness had always come with explanation, with conditions, with expectations that tightened around you like wire. Here, there was none of that. He ate because he was hungry. He fed us because we were hungry. The simplicity of it was almost offensive. A woman near the front, Greta, a former schoolteacher, took a breath that shook visibly through her shoulders. Slowly, as if afraid of waking someone, she raised her spoon and dipped it into the stew. It came back full, heavy with meat and potato. She hesitated, then brought it to her mouth. She closed her eyes as she swallowed. Nothing happened. No shout, no blow, no laughter. The cowboy did not react at all. He took another bite of his own meal. One by one, others followed. A spoon lifted. Another. The sound returned to the hall, not loud, not joyous, but tentative and real. The quiet clink of metal against metal. The shallow breaths of women eating after years of learning not to trust what was placed in front of them. When my turn came, my hand was shaking so badly I had to steady it with the edge of the table. I dipped the spoon, feeling its weight, and raised it slowly. The stew was hot enough to sting my lips, but I did not pull away. I swallowed. The taste was overwhelming. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was honest. Salt, fat, heat, the kind of food meant to sustain work, not impress. My throat tightened painfully, and for a moment I could not take another breath. Across the room, the cowboy finished his bowl. He set it down, wiped his mouth once with the back of his hand, and returned to the stove. Without comment, he dipped the ladle again and filled another bowl, Marta's empty one, and placed it gently in front of her. She stared at it as if it might speak. "There's more," he repeated, softer this time. "Eat." She did. Only later would I understand what that moment meant, not just for us, but for the men who ran this camp. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed adequately, that they not be starved or abused, but nothing in those rules demanded warmth. Nothing required patience. Nothing said the man serving the food had to eat the same meal, standing in the same room, under the same roof. This went beyond compliance. In America, I would learn, feeding people was not a gesture of power. It was a baseline of decency. You fed your family. You fed your neighbors. You fed hired hands. And when the war brought strangers, even enemies, into your care, you fed them too. Not to make a point, but because that was how things were done. No speeches, just action. As we ate, the guards remained where they were, relaxed, almost bored. This was not a test to them. This was routine. Somewhere beyond the fences I knew, ranches were being worked by men too young or too old for the front. Women ran farms, factories, offices. America was stretched thin, but it was not broken. The war had not reached into their kitchens. I thought of Hamburg, of the nights we spent in cellars listening to the city tear itself apart, of the ration cards, the empty markets, the way hunger became the background noise of every thought. Here, in Texas, the land itself seemed to resist scarcity. Cattle grazed in numbers we could not imagine. Crops grew unbothered by bombs. Factories ran day and night, turning steel and grain into ships, planes, food. The arsenal of democracy, they called it. But standing there with stew warming my stomach, I understood something else. Abundance, when paired with restraint, becomes mercy. The cowboy moved among us quietly, refilling bowls without comment, his boots soft on the wooden floor. When someone hesitated, he did not rush them. When someone spilled, he did not scold. He simply corrected the problem and moved on. At one point, our eyes met. He gave a brief nod, not approval, not pity, just acknowledgement, as if to say, "You're here, I'm here, this is what we do now." In that small exchange, something inside me loosened. I thought of my father, long dead by then, and the way he used to serve soup at the table, insisting everyone be seated before he began. I thought of my mother, who believed no meal should be eaten alone. For the first time since my capture, the distance between my life before the war and the one I was living now felt bridgeable. This, I realized, was not weakness. It was confidence so complete it did not need to announce itself. As we finished eating, the fear did not vanish entirely. It never does all at once. But it receded, pushed back by something far more dangerous to the stories we had been told. Normalcy. Men who fed their enemies because feeding people was what decent men did. A country strong enough to follow rules and generous enough to exceed them without applause. I looked around the hall at the women slowly lowering their spoons, at the empty bowls that had moments ago terrified us. And a thought formed, unbidden and unsettling, one that would not leave me. If this is who they are, then everything we were taught to hate was built on sand. The first spoonful should have been the end of it. Hunger satisfied. Curiosity answered. Fear proven unnecessary. That was what logic suggested. That was what should have happened. Instead, everything inside me began to come apart. I had lifted the spoon carefully, like someone handling an object that might disappear if touched too firmly. The stew was thick enough that it resisted, clinging to the metal as I raised it. A cube of beef sat in the bowl of the spoon, dark and solid, surrounded by potatoes that had not been boiled into nothingness. Steam curled upward and brushed my face, carrying a heat that felt almost intimate. I tasted it. Salt first, then fat, then the deep grounding flavor of meat that had been allowed to exist as itself. Not stretched, not diluted, not apologized for. My body reacted before my mind did. Something inside my chest lurched, hard and sudden, like a misstep on a stair I thought was there. My throat tightened violently. I swallowed once, then stopped breathing altogether. The room blurred, not because my eyes filled with tears yet, but because my vision could not decide where to land. I lowered the spoon back into the bowl and just stared at it. It did not vanish. No hand reached out to snatch the bowl away. No voice barked an order. No laughter followed. The stew sat there unchanged, heat still rising steadily as if it had all the time in the world. That was when my hands began to shake. I had eaten food before in captivity. Enough to survive, enough to move, to work, to obey. But this was different. This was not survival food. This was not a ration scraped together from absence. This was a meal, and I did not know how to exist in its presence. Around me, I sensed movement, sounds, the quiet rhythm of spoons lifting and lowering. Someone near the wall began to cry. Softly at first, then with a sharp intake of breath that she could not control. Another woman pushed her bowl away as if it had offended her, pressing her lips together so tightly they turned white. I tried to take another spoonful. I couldn't. My stomach twisted painfully, not from fullness but from something like panic. I had lived too long in a world where food was provisional, where it could be taken at any moment. You ate quickly, quietly, with one eye on the pot. You never trusted abundance. You never relaxed around it. I leaned forward slightly, elbows braced against the table, and forced myself to breathe. The stew smelled even richer now, the warmth rising up and wrapping around my face. For a moment, I was no longer in Texas. I was back in Hamburg, in my mother's kitchen before the war had stripped it bare. A pot simmered on the stove, lid tilted just enough to let the steam escape. She stirred slowly, humming under her breath, telling me not to touch it yet. Good food needs time, she used to say, and patience. The memory hit me with a force I had not expected. I pressed my lips together, but the sound still escaped. A small, broken sob that startled me with its volume. Tears came suddenly, hot and unstoppable, blurring everything. I turned my face away instinctively, ashamed of the weakness, but there was no hiding it. The sound spread, caught by others who were already breaking in their own quiet ways. We did not cry because the stew tasted good. We cried because it stayed. I lifted my head again, half expecting to see the bowl gone, to see a guard intervening, to be reminded that this had all been a mistake. But the stew was still there, unchanged, patient. The cowboy moved past me, refilling someone else's bowl, his boots soft against the floor. No one was counting. That realization broke something fundamental inside me. In Germany, by 1944, a bowl of soup was not food. It was currency. It was bargaining power. It was proof of who mattered and who did not. Mothers gave their portions to children. Children learned not to ask. Women traded anything they had left for a ladleful, thicker than water. Soup decided whether you worked or collapsed, whether you lived or disappeared quietly. And here, in America, soup was just lunch. That contrast was unbearable. I covered my mouth with one hand, trying to quiet the sound of my breathing, but the tears kept coming. They slid down my cheeks and dropped into the bowl, disappearing without a trace. I watched them fall. Each one swallowed immediately and felt an irrational surge of fear. What if this is the last of it? The thought was sharp and childish, but it lodged itself firmly in my chest. What if this was a single gesture, a momentary indulgence meant to confuse us? What if tomorrow the pot was empty again, and this memory became another thing we were expected to survive without? I ate faster then, panic driving the motion as if speed might preserve something. The spoon scraped against the bowl, louder than I intended. My hands trembled so badly I nearly spilled it. Across from me, Greta had stopped eating entirely. She stared at her bowl with wide, unblinking eyes, tears streaming freely down her face. "It's real," she whispered, as if convincing herself. "It's real." Marta, who had spilled her stew earlier, clutched her refilled bowl to her chest like a child, rocking slightly. She had taken only one bite and then stopped, lips pressed together as if afraid her body might betray her if she continued. "I can't finish it," she said, her voice barely audible. "If I finish it, it will be gone." I understood her perfectly. The cowboy passed again, pausing briefly beside her. Without comment, he set another ladleful into her bowl, raising the level back to where it had been before. He did not look at her face. He did not touch her. He simply ensured the stew remained. "There's more," he said again, as if this needed repeating. Marta let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob, and bent over the bowl, shoulders shaking. Something inside me collapsed then, fully and finally. Not my hunger, my certainty. For years I had survived by believing that the world was cruel because it had to be, that deprivation was universal, that suffering was evenly distributed, that everyone was paying the same price for the war. That belief had made the hunger bearable. It had given it meaning. But this exposed the lie. There was a place in the world where food had never disappeared, where farms grew uninterrupted, where factories produced not only weapons, but stability, where soup was not hoarded or weaponized, but served until people were full, and we had been told those people were monsters. I pressed my fingers into the edge of the table, grounding myself in the solidity of it. Wood. Real wood. Unscarred by shrapnel. The hall was warm, not from bodies packed too tightly, but from heat intentionally provided. Everything about this place suggested continuity, not desperation. The realization was dizzying. I cried because the stew did not need to be defended. I cried because no one asked for gratitude. I cried because this small, ordinary act, feeding us properly, patiently, had undone years of carefully constructed hatred more effectively than any argument ever could. When I finally finished my bowl, I did not push it away. I left it where it was, empty and clean, proof that it had existed at all. My chest ached, my eyes burned, and my stomach felt heavy in a way that was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Around me, the others slowly came back into themselves. Some ate in silence. Some wept openly. A few sat frozen, spoons untouched, overwhelmed by the choice itself. The guards did not intervene. The cowboy did not hurry us along. Time seemed to loosen its grip, allowing the moment to stretch until it could hold all of us. That afternoon, I would learn nothing new about America's laws, its policies, or its strategies. But I learned something far more destabilizing. There was a kind of power that did not need to announce itself, a confidence so complete it could afford to be gentle, a strength that did not fear feeding its enemies. And once you had tasted that, not just the food, but what it represented, there was no going back to the world as you had understood it before. The strangest part was not that we had been fed, it was how quickly the world rearranged itself afterward. When the bowls were collected and the hall slowly emptied, I expected the feeling to fade, to be replaced by the familiar dullness of captivity. Hunger, after all, had always returned. Reality had always reasserted itself. But as we stepped back out into the Texas sun, something had shifted permanently, like a bone that had set crooked and would never straighten again. I walked more slowly than usual, my body heavy, my thoughts heavier still. They defeated us without a weapon. The realization came uninvited, sharp and humiliating in its clarity. All the years of training, of slogans and certainty, of carefully rehearsed hatred, it had all collapsed under the weight of a single meal served without ceremony. It was not America that was cruel. It was Germany that had lied. That truth settled into me gradually, not as anger, but as something colder and more devastating. Recognition. We had been told that strength required hardness, that mercy was weakness, that to rule was to deprive. Yet here stood a country powerful enough to fight a global war and still find room for restraint. No one had asked us to understand this. No one had explained it. The cowboy had not apologized for feeding us, nor had he demanded gratitude. He had not used the moment to teach or to humiliate. He had simply done what he believed was right and moved on. That was the most unsettling lesson of all. In Germany, morality was loud. It marched, it shouted, it wrapped itself in banners and demanded obedience. Here, morality was quiet. It showed up with rolled sleeves and a ladle, did its work, and expected nothing in return. If someone's hungry, you feed them. I would hear that phrase later, spoken by another guard in passing as if it were obvious. At the time, it stunned me, not because it was complex, but because it was not. There was no ideology in it, no justification, just a line drawn so simply that it could not be argued. That simplicity was a luxury of confidence. The men who ran this camp, most of them farmers, ranch hands, mechanics before the war, did not see themselves as moral heroes. They did not speak about values or destiny. They did their jobs, followed the rules, and when the rules ended, relied on instinct shaped by a lifetime of ordinary decency. This was the generation they would later call the greatest. Not because they talked about greatness, but because they never needed to. In the days that followed, the stew was not mentioned again. Meals continued as they always had at Camp Hearn, regular, adequate, unremarkable by American standards. But for us, everything had changed. Every tray set down in front of us carried the echo of that first meal. Every full bowl chipped away at the image we had been raised to fear. I watched the guards more closely after that. They did not gloat. They did not soften in ways that felt performative. They enforced rules calmly, consistently. Work details were assigned without cruelty. When someone struggled, instruction was given, not punishment. This was not kindness meant to impress. It was kindness built into the system, reinforced by habit. The Geneva Convention demanded fairness. America delivered something more durable, predictability. And predictability, after years of chaos, felt like mercy. At night, lying on my bunk, I thought about the stories I had believed so completely, about the caricatures of Americans as decadent, cruel, incapable of discipline. Those stories had sustained us through hunger and fear because they made suffering meaningful. They gave it a villain, but villains do not ladle stew and wait patiently for you to decide whether to trust them. I thought of the cowboy again, the way he stood at the counter, eating quietly, not watching us to see what we would do. He had not needed to prove anything. He knew who he was. He knew what his country could afford. That knowledge, I realized, was power. Germany had demanded belief to survive. America did not. Outside the camp fences, the war continued. We heard snippets of news carried by guards who did not lower their voices. Allied advances, cities liberated, production numbers that sounded unreal, planes, ships, tanks counted in quantities that made the mind recoil. While Europe burned itself down, America built, fed, and waited. The contrast was no longer theoretical. It lived in our bodies. I saw it in the way Marta began to sleep through the night for the first time in months, in the way Greta started teaching English words to the younger women, curiosity replacing suspicion, in the way even the most rigid among us, those who had clung hardest to ideology, fell silent, their certainty eroded not by argument but by consistency. This was not re-education, it was exposure. The moral awakening did not come with a speech or a confession. It came quietly, in the realization that cruelty was not inevitable, that strength did not require dehumanization, that power could coexist with restraint. They had not defeated us on the battlefield. They had defeated us here, in this place of dust and fences, by refusing to become what we expected them to be. That refusal demanded a reckoning. If America could afford humanity in wartime, what excuse had we ever had? I understood then why the cowboy did not wait for thanks. Gratitude would have placed him above us, turned the act into charity. That was not what this was. This was something far more unsettling. Equality in appetite, shared rules, shared space. He fed us not because we were worthy, but because hunger did not care about worth. That idea stripped away years of conditioning in a single stroke. I wondered what my father would have thought had he lived to see this. He had believed deeply in order, in obedience, in the necessity of sacrifice. Would he have recognized the difference between sacrifice imposed and sacrifice chosen? Between power enforced and power restrained? I did not know, but I knew this. If I ever told this story, I would not describe the stew in detail. I would not linger on the taste or the tears. I would talk about the man who did not yell, the country that did not need to. And the moment I understood that the war had been lost long before Germany surrendered, lost the instant we learned that our enemy could remain decent without asking permission. That knowledge did not free me, but it changed me, and I suspected, even then, that it would outlive the war itself, carried home in the memories of women like me, passed quietly to children and grandchildren who would grow up believing that America, at its best, once chose humanity when it did not have to. That was a story worth remembering. Years later, when I tried to explain what happened at Camp Hearn, I always struggled with the same question. Not what they did, but who they were. Because what unsettled me most was not the stew, or the kindness, or even the moral collapse that followed. It was the country behind it all, the quiet confidence of it, the absence of fear in the way Americans carried themselves during a war that touched nearly every corner of the world. I often found myself asking a question that had no easy answer. What kind of country was this? In 1944, America felt singular in its purpose. That much was obvious even from behind barbed wire. There was no confusion about who the enemy was or what needed to be done. Factories ran day and night. Trains crossed the continent loaded with steel, grain, fuel. Men left farms and shops and offices not because they were forced to, but because everyone understood the same truth. The war had to be won, and it had to be won together. There was disagreement, of course. There always is. But it did not fracture the whole. You could feel that unity even inside the camp. Guards came from different states, different backgrounds, different accents. Cowboys from Texas, factory workers from Michigan, farmers from Iowa. They did not talk politics with us. They talked about shifts, weather, letters from home. Their differences existed, but they were not weapons turned inward. America in the 1940s was a country at work, not just militarily, but morally. The men who guarded us did not speak about values because they lived them without comment. They trusted institutions. They trusted each other. They trusted that tomorrow would still resemble today, only better. That trust created a stability so deep it allowed room for restraint, even toward enemies. I did not understand that at the time. I only felt it. But now, looking back across decades, I see the contrast more clearly than I ever could then. Today's America feels different. I say that not with judgment, but with sorrow. The confidence I once sensed, quiet, unquestioned, now seems replaced by doubt. Not doubt about enemies abroad, but about one another. Where Americans once shared a common direction, they now seem to face inward, measuring loyalty, questioning motives, dividing themselves into camps more rigid than any prison fence I ever knew. The unity that once powered factories and farms now fractures across screens and slogans. In 1944, America knew who it was fighting. Today, it sometimes seems unsure who it is. I do not pretend to understand all the reasons. History is complicated, and every era carries its own burdens. But from the outside, from the perspective of someone who once feared Americans as monsters and then learned otherwise, the difference feels profound. Back then, Americans believed in systems larger than themselves. They believed production mattered, that sacrifice was shared, that disagreements could be postponed because survival required focus. They trusted that their neighbors were pulling in the same direction, even if they argued about the details. That trust was visible in small things. In the way food was distributed without suspicion. In the way rules were enforced without cruelty. In the way kindness was offered without performance. None of it felt fragile. That is what lingers with me now, the sense that America once possessed a moral surplus, enough confidence to extend humanity without fearing it would be exploited, enough unity to treat enemies decently without questioning its own strength. Would that still be possible today? I ask that question not as an accusation, but as a mirror. Would a country so divided still feed its prisoners without hesitation? Would it still trust its institutions to act humanely without public spectacle? Would it still believe that decency is not weakness? I do not know the answers, but I know this. The America I encountered in 1944 did not need to convince itself of its values. It assumed them. That assumption freed people to act simply, without fear of being misunderstood by their own side. That freedom feels rarer now. When I watch modern Americans argue about history, about what should be remembered, what should be forgotten, I want to tell them this story not as praise, but as proof. Proof that their country once held power without paranoia, that it once faced the world outward instead of turning on itself. I want them to know that enemies noticed. We noticed when America chose consistency over cruelty. We noticed when it followed rules, even when no one was watching. We noticed when it fed us because hunger needed no justification. Those choices mattered more than speeches, more than flags, more than slogans. They shaped how we remembered America long after the war ended. I sometimes imagine an American family sitting together decades from now. Grandparents who lived through the war, parents who inherited its stories, children who struggle to understand why it still matters. I wonder what version of the country they are being taught to see. And I hope, quietly, stubbornly, that somewhere beneath the noise, the old instincts remain. The instinct to build rather than burn, to trust rather than suspect, to feed rather than punish. Because if a nation could do that in 1944 while fighting the largest war in human history, then the question is not whether it was possible. The question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Would we still do this today? The war ended the way wars usually do, suddenly on paper, slowly in people. By the time we were told that Germany had surrendered, most of us had already understood what defeat really meant. It had not arrived with flags or announcements. It had arrived quietly, earlier, in moments that did not look like victory at all. It arrived with food that was never taken back, with rules that were enforced without cruelty, with men who had the power to hurt us and chose not to. After repatriation, after the long journey home to a country reduced to rubble, many of us tried to explain what captivity in America had been like. At first, people did not believe us. They could not reconcile the image they had carried of America with the stories we told. You were lucky, some said dismissively. They were pretending, others insisted. But time has a way of sorting truth from comfort. As years passed, diaries surfaced, letters were shared, the stories repeated themselves, not word for word, but in spirit. Different camps, different guards, different states, yet the same details returned again and again: the food, the order, the restraint. Former prisoners told their children about Texas heat and Wisconsin snow, about cowboys and farmers who guarded them, about meals that came regularly without bargaining or fear, about the strange realization that they had eaten better as captives than their families had at home. Those children grew up. Some emigrated. Some visited America decades later. Some wrote letters to former guards or their families when they could find them. A few stood at memorials, not to mourn defeat, but to acknowledge something more complicated: gratitude. Not gratitude for victory or mercy bestowed from above, but gratitude for being treated as human when it was not required. I carried that gratitude quietly for the rest of my life. It was not loud. It did not demand recognition. It lived in small choices, in how I fed my own children, in how I spoke about enemies, in how I understood power. Whenever I heard someone claim that cruelty was necessary, that fear was the only way to govern, I thought of Camp Hearn. I thought of a man in rolled sleeves who did not yell. They fed us when they didn't have to, I would say when asked. That is what defeated us forever. Not bombs, not armies, not speeches. Food given without conditions. Looking back now, I understand why that moment mattered so much. Power reveals itself most clearly not in what it can take, but in what it refuses to take. America in 1944 had every justification to be harsh. It was fighting for survival. Its sons were dying overseas. Its resources were stretched across oceans. And still, it chose restraint. That choice did not weaken it. It defined it. For those of us who had been raised to believe that dominance required dehumanization, the lesson was irreversible. You could not unlearn it. You could not unknow it. Once you had seen power exercised with humanity, every other version of power felt exposed for what it was. This is why these stories matter, not to glorify the past or pretend it was perfect, but to remind those who inherit that legacy what it once looked like at its best, to show that decency is not an accident of peace, but a discipline practiced under pressure. To the Americans who hear this story now, especially those whose grandparents wore uniforms, worked factories, or guarded camps, I hope you feel what we felt. Not shame, not obligation, but pride. Pride in a country that once understood that strength and humanity are not opposites. That the greatest generation did not announce its values, it lived them, quietly, consistently, without applause. If you wonder what made them great, it was not victory alone. It was the way they behaved when they had the upper hand. That legacy does not belong to history alone. It belongs to anyone willing to carry it forward. And if these stories are remembered, not as myths but as lived experiences, then perhaps they can still do what they once did to us. Not conquer, not divide, but remind us who we are capable of being,